Okay, yesterday it seemed like there were more questions than we had time to deal with, so I thought I could kind of do a retrograde thing with the thing and try to deal with some more questions and concerning evolutionary astrology. So whatever questions you have, just ask away and I'll try and deal with it. Yes?
Jeffrey, a few years ago, you had talked about 2001, 2, and 3 being critical years as to the choice of humanity and how it would affect 2012 and the outcome of those decisions during this period of time. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you see if you looked at that some more?
Well, maybe a way to answer that is to understand the Uranus transit a little bit more deeply, beyond just the Uranus transiting into the sign that it's in, i.e. Pisces. The reality is that as any planet, it has its own north and south node. And those south node is roughly 14, 15 Sagittarius. The north node is roughly 12, 13 Gemini. Now, if you look at history, which is the proof of things, going back to the 1960s was when Uranus was in Virgo, and of course squaring its nodes. Now, if we remember the 60s, we remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We remember Vietnam War. We remember civil rights. We remember revolution, socially. We remember the Great Society of Johnson and what these things set in motion beyond the event, what those symbolize. If you go further back, when Uranus was in Pisces before, this will correlate essentially to the 1920s relative to the context we call Germany. This gave rise to Hitler. In our country, and all that meant as it carried forwards, in our country it correlated to one of the worst corrupt presidents we ever had. Harding, Teapot Dome, oil. It correlated with a social movement of Puritanism manifesting as prohibition. It correlated to the invention of the credit card and unsecured credit, which led to the Depression. So the point I'm making is that Uranus has a direct application to transformation and has a direct application to trauma. And what we're talking about here is social traumas, social fracturing. And so here we have Uranus, and you could just go back in history, is my point, if you want to make the effort for those historians. And it works like clockwork. If you go back as an example to the south node of Uranus, when Pluto transited that south node, correlated to 9/11. 9/11. Direct correlation. And at that particular point in time, the Saturn transit was directly over Kabul, Afghanistan. Twin towers. Saturn, Gemini, twin towers. And so now we have Uranus and Pisces again. It's beginning to form a square to the nodal axis of itself. Now clearly, if this country, my view is that if this country, and I don't mean to offend any of the Bushies in the audience, But if this country continues on its course, which is essentially a course of world domination, you're going to have a reaction at some point. I'll just leave it right there. What other happy questions? Yes?
I have a question about past life suicides. And a happy question. Anyway, in regards to past life
I
suicides.
can't hear you, Kim.
Okay. In regards to past life suicides.
Yes.
Could you? I mean, I know we didn't really go over it last year in the Pluto school. Could you talk about how, what sort of karmic situations that may carry through to the next life, and then perhaps onto other lives, and
I'm sorry, I have really poor hearing and I
Yeah.
can't hear you. Thank you. just shout it in.
I'll get over my fear of public exposure.
Oh, this curator around here. This is Kim.
In regards to past life suicides, could you talk about the karmic circumstances and how they may carry through to the next life and then even on to following lives?
Yes.
And
Good. It shouldn't be any mystery. If one studies the history of any world religion, be it Islam, be it Hinduism, Vedanta, Christianity, Buddhism, they all have injunctions against committing suicide. And the essential underlying reason for that, it pretty much infers that one is running away from whatever the purposes and the reasons are for the life being lived, no matter how difficult it may be. And when an act of suicide is then committed, whatever the reasons are, the only exception in reality is when a body is in a terminal state of illness. That's the only exception. But when a person is committing suicide other than this, then what happens karmically is that soul has to spend X amount of time in what, if we use Christian terminology, would be called the astral hell. Now, the astral hell is not just one thing. There's 7 dimensions of it, as there's 7 dimensions of the astral heaven. But even basically, in a general rule, that when a soul commits suicide, it goes to the first level of hell. That's severe enough. And this is intentional by God, God's law. And the intention behind it is to get the soul so freaked out, so scared, that it will never do it again. If it's just a first act of suicide, the length of time spent there is only, in our time of measurement, roughly 7 days. But it's scary enough. And when that soul is then reborn, it has to come back into a life and repeat the lessons avoided twofold. So, those aren't my rules. I'm more compassionate than that. So, let's go get a doobie or something. We'll talk about it. That's my way. Pisces moon, but okay. Any other loose ends or questions you want to bring up? Any question you want to bring up? Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question on what your opinion is on the nature of evil and how acts of evil affect evolutionary astrology.
How does evil affect evolutionary?
Yes. What is the nature of the impact on it?
Well, from the point of view of EA, it's simply a matter of understanding the archetype, understanding the energy, understanding how it manifests in individual and collective life. And from the point of view of EA, you can, because the energy of evil evil is created by God. And we have to remember that the very nature of the Latin word Lucifer means bearer of light. And what this means is the way that, I will explain it the way Yogananda explained it, instead of giving you my opinion. But my opinion is in conformity to Yogananda, so. Lucifer was an archangel, what we can call an archangel, created by God. And there came a point in time in which Lucifer was directed by God to come to planets, not just this one, but planets like this, in order to, in quotes, serve the people on those sorts of planets, to be an archangel. But Lucifer, at that point, created a delusion for itself. And that delusion, manifesting as a conversation with what we can call God, goes more or less like, well, these people should be serving me, not me serving. Once Lucifer applied his will in that direction and made a decision to insist on that orientation, in Christian terms, it fell from grace and became evil. Now, this is a very important thing to understand, because once that occurred to Lucifer, it simultaneously felt victimized by God. Now that should tell us something. We live in America and much of the Western world and cultures and peoples that feel victimized. One of the last things that cultures like this try to do is help people understand the responsibility in their own actions. It's a lot easier to be a victim, to point fingers, to blame, rather than to point fingers at oneself. So the bottom line is that Lucifer is a very specific consciousness. It is as omniscient and omnipotent, almost at an equal level with God. From the point of view of the manifested creation, I'll try to explain this from an astrophysical point of view. We all know that there's a thing called matter and antimatter. When matter and antimatter meet, they equally destroy themselves. From the point of view of the manifested creation, from an astrophysical, provable point of view, there's literally 51% matter, 49% antimatter throughout the manifested creation. From this point of view, we can correlate matter with the energy, direction, and consciousness of God. From the point of view of antimatter, we can correlate it with the consciousness of evil. All of us have matter and antimatter within us. We all have good and evil within us. Evil operates not only through the consciousness of victimization, but any negative emotion. And all of us come into whatever life with wounds that we ourselves are responsible for creating. And one of the ways that the energy of evil / Lucifer manifests is to try to come into our soul and affect where we are intrinsically, emotionally wounded. And let's take an example. Let's say a person has Venus in Scorpio. And from birth they have intrinsic fears of loss, betrayal, abandonment, jealousy issues, possession issues that come out of that. How many of you have Venus in Scorpio? Some do, and you're not putting up your hands. I can feel it. So let's say we're dealing with, somebody has Venus in Scorpio. And we'll just make a little scenario here. And we'll imagine that Venus in Scorpio person sitting in their home, and they have a partner, of course, and partner comes home from somewhere. And here's this person got these intrinsic fears, yes? And they start communicating or relating Venus that they have been attracted to someone else. Now, you can imagine just how the Venus in Scorpio is going to take that in relative to the pre-existing fears. So on the one hand, we have emotions that are natural to that Venus in Scorpio, and now it's a negative emotion. And this is where Lucifer can come right on in there, take them over, and magnify them. And through the process of magnification, we have increasing distortion of those natural emotions. And as those emotions now become magnified and distorted, they become projected onto that partner who came home trying to be honest. What kind of realities does this begin to set in motion through the sheer influence of Lucifer? See my point? It's the most common way that evil/Lucifer operates in our life. On a collective level, and this is the danger of our time now, we literally have, I'm sorry to say that on our earth now we have a progressive permeation of the energy of evil. And I wanted to see one of the particular psychologies that evil can really manifest through is the psychology of self-interest. Now, which has many manifestations. One of the most dangerous times is when evil hides behind God and you don't know it. Right now, most of us, because we live in the West, would accept the thought that evil seems to be hiding behind the Islamic God, as manifested through bin Laden and those characters. We wouldn't have too much of a problem accepting that. But because you're living in the West and the country you're living in, it'd be, for some of you anyway, a little bit harder to accept the fact that evil is also hiding behind people like Bush and his goons. Now, and the way to validate this is simple. If people like Bush and his goons were truly people of God, / the teachings of Jesus, what Jesus actually taught, they'd be walking the talk. They'd be creating social, economic policies that reflected those teachings. Yes or no? Thank you, son. There is my validation. But clearly, this is not occurring. What do we have here, even as we speak? As a people controlling our government, which are gutting the few programs left that aid the poor. And making yet additional tax breaks for the rich. Does that sound like Jesus? So what is it then? So this is my point about, in this guise, they're all defined by self-interest. And their self-interest is to have more power, have more money, and to create a one-party system that would never lose power in this country in order to perpetually secure their position. That's what you have, in essence. If you just stand back, objectify the thing. So in essence, we now have evil hiding behind these two gods, Islamic God, Christian God. And so in essence, to answer your question, what we now have on our planet, this might sound strange, evil fighting evil. And the intention in that is to induce. Somebody asked me yesterday, what does this Saturn transit mean in Cancer squaring the nodes? And I pointed out it's not only squaring the nodes, it's also conjunct its own north node. I was talking about the collective feeling of heaviness, of grief, of powerlessness, of futility, and all the rest that we know. Yes or no? We don't even know why we're feeling it. We just do. It's a collective pull. And that's one of the surest ways to know evil is alive and well in our universe. Because evil is fighting evil in order to induce, create that kind of negative emotional reality. Again, evil operates through negative emotions. And going back to what Daniel was asking, do you see what I'm getting at now? We're in an incredibly dangerous time. Particularly when we understand the type of weaponry that can be used by evil. Does that answer your question? Way back here.
What can we do? I mean,
Light up that doobie. That takes care of the whole version. No, seriously, I know you're serious.
Counterbalance that. I mean, there's something we can do.
The thing to do is to remember, always remember. You see, let me say one more thing, and I'll answer your question directly. At least in this here country, the televised media has been completely co-opted. It's no longer news, it's called propaganda. And they're trying to convince you, relative to the last election, that somehow the entire United States has become suddenly en masse evangelical. They're all just waiting for the rapture. And it's just not true. 50% of the United States remains opposed to this goon called Bush. That's not changed. You wouldn't know it by listening to your media. So my point is to remember that at least as we speak, in our U.S., but there's still 50% of the population that ain't buying into this program. And to always remember that God is stronger than evil. One of the intentions of evil is to create such a psychological state of futility that we just get into a state of self-defeat. And we don't do the things that we need to do to counteract these forces. Number one of which is to do something within your personal spiritual life. To continually try to ask or access God as you know it. One of the secrets in natural law is that however you define God is exactly how you will experience it. That's your business. But however you define God, make the effort every single day, knowing what's on the line, to find that inner feeling of God, Goddess within yourself. Try to join forces, find families. We're creating a family here. There's other groups, there's other families. The point is not to give up the ship, to continue to walk on, to continue to fight for what is right. Everything on earth has a limit, and these creeps have a limit. the scales will be balanced coming out of the 1920s in this country because of the corruption of the 20s. Very few people even remember modern history. In the early 1930s, as a reaction to the corruption of the 20s and the evil therein, 3 million Americans signed up to be communists and became part of the Communist Party. Do you see my point? There will be a reaction. So keep hanging on. Light up that doobie. We will get there. Yes.
Can you speak a bit about the nature of eclipses and what influence they bring to the evolutionary impulse? So little info, I think, on eclipses.
Well, there's one book written on it that was fairly relevant. I'm not even sure it's in print anymore. I'm going to start dating myself yet again, but there was an old-time astrologer, a very excellent astrologer, by the way. His main thing was medical astrology, a guy named Robert Jansky. And very few people remember him anymore. He basically committed suicide subconsciously in the early 80s. He perpetual chain smoker and workaholic and all the rest of it. And he was my first mentor in astrology. That's why I know the guy. And he was, a great guy. But he wrote a book on eclipses. And it's probably, in terms of the astrological literature of things, that to me would be the only one relevant book that I know of on eclipses. The essential assumption in the eclipse is that where the eclipse point falls is meant to emphasize that area or archetype of your life for the next 6 months. On an emotional, psychological level, it becomes a lead point in your life. Any other questions? Yes.
How do you speak to the age-old question about every time we look at a chart, we're assuming that person's been around. And I'm asked the question, population is growing. There weren't that many people back
That's
then
right.
when we're assuming that we've all been around. So how do you address that question?
Well, that's really the heart of evolutionary astrology, because this is why we need to understand the 4 natural evolutionary conditions. Souls either evolve in the human condition from other forms of life, or are created by God and put into human form. And the way that you measure this through natural law is that for souls that are coming into human form from other forms of life, initially would be in a very dim state of evolution, which is why a basic sense of occupying time and space only. And modern psychology and medicine has invented all kinds of terminology for this, creationism, and so forth. Yes? And then the soul progressively evolves. So we can look out and measure this empirically. And then you have the obvious phenomena of just procreation over lengths of time, which are automatically going to multiply your population. You have to remember also that Earth is not the only place that Earth or life exists. By the fact that you're sitting here on Earth in this particular life doesn't mean that you haven't been elsewhere, and vice versa. All of these become all contributing dynamics to understand your question. There are some souls, there are certain souls that have been in human form not very much. And yet they find themselves, because they've been elsewhere. They've been in other forms. And all of a sudden they find themselves in human form. You should do these charts sometime. They're really amazing. There's even some charts, like when I was down in Israel visiting with Maurice. And, this notion of certain alien people that are somehow taking humans and impregnating and trying to blend genes and produce hybrids. And one of these races is supposed to be, one of these alien forms is supposed to be wasp-like or looking like wasps. And, frankly, for a lot of years I went, wow, this is crap. It was just past the doobie. But, but I was down here visiting Maurice, and I did X amount of charts down there. And there was a guy that showed up literally claiming to be one of these hybrids. And he was on the verge of suicide because part of him was human and claimed to be another part of him was wasp-like, and these wasp characters, according to him, have an intention of taking over the entire earth. And by creating the appearance of humanity so where you can't really see what's going on. And I was listening to all this and trying to figure out if he had some sort of other distortions going on psychologically that would account for this story, looking as desperately as I could. And I said, well, okay. So I stepped back. I said, well, look, if what you're telling me is true, why don't you show me? Show me with your eyes. Just let the human part go and show me what you are talking about. This is a true story. And the guy did. And I was freaked. Really fucking freaked. Because I saw it. There's a little astray of your question, but... And, so, he literally was going to... Do you remember that guy? Yeah. And, What? When literally what came through the eye was the image of what he really was. And it looked like one giant wasp head. And he was, literally he wanted to kill himself. The human wanted to kill because he didn't want the planet taken over. That's why he wanted to commit the suicide. And he had 2 kids. Huh? I have no idea. All the charts I've seen, I can't remember that one. So.
You stay in Sedona for a while, you get a lot of those people. A lot of things going on in Sedona.
What?
A lot of that going on in Sedona.
A lot of stuff going on in Sedona.
Well. Let's get out of here. So, yes.
Well, on a little bit lighter vein.
Thank you.
What is your take on soulmates and twin flames?
Oh, boy. Oh, golly. Well, things to just turn, this whole thing is completely confused. When he wrote that book, Soulmates, and everybody was running around looking for their soulmates and all this stuff. And there's detailed descriptions on these things in Pluto, too, to start with. But let me clear up this issue of true soulmates. Believe it or not, Jesus had a definition or a way of communicating what he thought soulmates were and or are. And of course, I completely agree with what he was saying. According to Jesus, soulmates are 2 people who have independently committed their life to God. And that means living it. And the reason that they would be in a relationship is to enhance and expand upon that God discovery together. This then allows, of course, for unconditional love, because their primary relationship is with God, in which they see the mutual divinity in each other. To me, those are soulmates. Most of our relationships are what I call in Pluto 2, karma mates. And that's where Jess Stern got real confused. Karma mates are simply 2 souls who have been together and other times, in which their journey together is not yet finished. That will describe the balance, the vast majority. Twin souls are what in other jargon is called twin flames. These are two souls that have been created by God exactly at the same point in time. And therefore their evolutionary journey through time, space, has been identical. One of the core reasons that meaning they're the same. One of the core reasons that any of us are in a relationship with another is to confront our personal limitations through the interface in our relationship with another. And the positive intention is a metamorphosis of those limitations that we create for one another. Since twin souls or twin flames are the same, there's no counterpoint, and therefore no evolutionary or karmic reason to be together. Of all the charts I've done in this life, which are many, about 30,000, a lot. So one of the reasons I hobble along, you can only take in so much. Every cup has a limit. But of all those charts, I would say I have 20 or so documented cases of twin souls actually meeting. And only of those 20, one set tried to live together. And yes, they were Leos. And after the initial fascination and infatuation with Leo, then they got bored to tears and carried on. So, yes, sir.
Would you extend that just a little farther and talk about same souls?
That's what it is, same soul. The same soul is a soul which, at a certain point in evolution, meaning roughly third stage individuated and above, it becomes possible for a soul to split itself and create the appearance of distinct people. The maximum number it can do is 3, and the Trinity. And the intention is to accelerate the evolution of the soul back to God. That's the intention. That's a historical fact. It's not just me making that up. So, Julio.
You talk about God and archangels and fallen angels with relevance to Saturn and the law, and God as being a transcendental, omniconscious being. How does Jehovah fit into that? I've always been curious.
I'm sorry, I just can't hear.
How does Jehovah fit into the idea of God, archangel, Saturn, the lessons that we're learning? Is Jehovah, because Jehovah is like, all those angels are from Jehovah, right?
Of course.
Well, how does Jehovah fit in? Because from a Buddhist point of view, it's like beyond
What is
that.
it? How does it fit into what?
How does he? Who is he? Or what is his deal?
Buddhist? Because Buddhist, the core of Buddhist understanding is that what we call the source or God, the ultimate. We have a manifested creation. Something had to create it, and from a Buddhist point of view, that something is utterly impersonal. And that's why when a Buddhist goes into expanded states of consciousness, what they experience within, based on that definition, is pure light. But other philosophies would say this, as in, say, Vedanta. Okay, this is now mimicking Vedantic dialogue. You may be right, that this ultimate source of all things is impersonal. And yet, it also has created all things, including the human form. And therefore, that ultimate something has the capacity to manifest itself in the totality of its creation, including human form. And therefore, we can have what are called agents of God. or archangels.
So Jehovah, his deal was real strict, very Saturn, Jehovah. So is Saturn Jehovah? Is that the projection of Jehovah?
Why is Saturn Jehovah?
Because Saturn's like the Sabbath, the Jewish calendar, and the Jewish people of Jehovah. That's implementing the Western world with Christianity.
You're getting confused. You're getting confused with the law created by the source. The law is Saturn.
Okay, and who is Jehovah?
Neptune.
Who is Jehovah? I mean, the whole Old Testament is based on the Muslims and the Jews and Jehovah, and those guys. To me, Jehovah seemed like a lot of shadow. Is Jehovah partly half Satan, half God? Who is Jehovah? Does that make sense?
It's called God.
Jehovah is God.
That is a manifestation
Or
of
just
God.
one phase of God, one representation. Isn't Uranus God and Neptune God?
Wait a minute, where are we going?
Because we're talking about God and evil. So who is Jehovah? Because Jehovah seemed evil to me in the Old Testament.
Jehovah is a definition of God that came through a collective race. We're all free to define God as we wish. And again, how we define God, Saturn definition, we will experience. There was a race of people that defined an aspect of God, in your terminology, called Jehovah. That's all.
But that definition is what's bringing on the war between Christianity and Muslims. There's Jehovah's behind that. Jehovah.
What? Huh? I'm sorry. Let's have this dialogue later, Julio. Yes, ma'am.
Two quick correlation questions. The principle of synchronicity, is that Sagittarius or Uranus or Aquarius?
The idea of
It
synchronicity,
falls in which archetype?
and you're asking what is the actual correlation?
Yeah.
Synchronicity?
Yeah.
Boy, I've never even thought about that.
It feels to me,
That's
it
amazing.
feels Uranian, and it also feels Sagittarian, because there's the macrocosm, the microcosm in Sagittarius, and then there's also in Aquarius, it's the projection of thought that then reality conforms to the projection of thought, the inner world and the outer world. Do you have?
I would probably put it under a triad versus one sign rulership. The triad I would link it to intuitively is Aquarius, Gemini, Libra.
One other correlation question then was the principle of introjection. Like in psychological terms, when you interject something, is that part
Interjection?
of Venus? Introject. Is that Venus or Moon?
That's Uranus.
That's Uranus.
No different than Uranus also correlating with projection. We also have interjection. Huh?
Venus also correlates with projection too, though. And I was thinking that the inner side of Venus and the outer side of Venus, there's one side of Venus that is projection, and the other side of Venus, which is the internal side, which might be introjection.
Fine, it's all part of that triad, Aquarius, Gemini, yeah. Yes.
Do you have a sense of the percentage of daemon souls on the
I
planet?
can't-
A percentage of daemon souls on the planet?
Sorry.
Do you have a sense of the percentage of daemon souls on the planet at this time?
The percentage of daemon souls on the planet at this time.
Yeah.
Whoa. No, I don't. No, I really don't have my sense when you ask me the question, my intuition tells me 20%, but I don't know if it's right or wrong.
A question about the basic path towards merging with the source. I have a feeling that there are many of them, from all different cultures, people follow all these different paths, and probably the last step of actually merging is in fact the same.
Yes, that's exactly right. One of the old sayings out of many religions is that all spokes lead to the same hub. And we have to remember too that, there's, for the balance of human history, the majority, the vast majority, there was no religion. There was no cosmology. This idea, this thing we call God, was not even a conception. God is a conception. It was not an abstract conception until 7000 BCE. That's pretty recent human development. And in fact, that original conception was not a male, it was a female. The original conception of goddess, the word would be Namu, N-A-M-U. So then you ask the question, what came before? And this is what I mean about it's intrinsic to consciousness. What's intrinsic to it is a transcendent impulse. Intrinsically, because we're all created by that something, God. And there are many different ways throughout the balance of human history that the human organism would access that impulse that had nothing to do with cosmologies or conceptions of God or formalized religions. The primary way for the balance of human history was through psychotropic plants that were also created by this thing we call God, that have naturally transcendent effects within the chemistry of the brain. And the other primary way, it goes right back to natural law, that there's a natural law called cause and effect. And this is reflected in our breathing. Inhale, exhale, cause, effect. Thought, counterthought. As long as we have breathing in our body, our brain has left brain activity that is analogous to static on a radio. I can be going through the radio dial, and at various points I have signals. But on each side of those signals, there are static. So we have the purity of a signal, but we also have static. The static, the pure signal is your right brain. The static is your left brain relative to cause-effect. So before cosmologies were invented and all that, human organism knew how to access the transcendent impulse through calming and shallowing and stopping the breathing. Once the breath is relatively shallow and stop, consciousness is now free from law of cause and effect. Remembering that consciousness is not dependent on this. It's just energy. So a good way to illustrate this is in a Taoist model. Original Taoism was a function of natural law. And one of the ways they like to illustrate this thing is through through numbers. 1, 2. 1 and 2 would correlate with the natural law of finitude, mortality. And yet there's also, in this is Taoist speaking, an interval between that 1, 2. And the interval here correlates with timelessness, the absolute. So in a very simple Taoist meditation model, all it is mentally affirming the number 1 on your inhaling breath, and mentally affirming the number 2 on your outgoing breath, wherein the secret is the concentration on the 1, 2, not the breathing. And as you concentrate on the 1, 2, much to the soul's surprise, the breath begins to shallow and stop without consciousness noticing. And as this begins, and as the breath begins to shallow, this will set in motion 3 archetypical experiences that will happen to any consciousness, independent of culture, independent of race, and independent of cosmology. It is intrinsic to soul in human form. And what those 3 archetypical experiences are, this is something you can all prove to yourself. You don't have to believe anything that I'm saying. You can literally prove it to yourself. And what that first experience is that when the breath is relatively shallow, the very density in our molecular mass, or cells, changes. And when that begins, from the point of view of the interior of your consciousness, it will seem like what is outside of you, the earth, has gone into some sort of earthquake thing. But you can open your eye and the earth will be fine. And what that is reflecting is exactly what I'm telling you, the shift in the molecular density. This is what happened actually to one of the popes, the guy he liked a lot, John of the Cross. And they actually literally had to keep John of the Cross inside of a building because he had changed the density of his molecules so much that he flew. And they had to keep him entrapped. And so this is your first stage. And then in time, this will give way, transform, change, to the second stage. And this is when you're, from the point of view of the interior of your consciousness. Suddenly, it will seem like it's surrounded by 3 or 4 colors, like galaxies, swirling. And those colors are purple, blue, gold, white. And this will go on for X amount of time. And then finally, it leads to the third stage, Trinity. And this is the stage when the swirling colors solidify to what people want to call a third eye. And it solidifies into a sphere. And from the point of view of the interior of your consciousness, that's what you perceive. Perception, Pluto, soul. Pluto, perception, proof. And one of the things to know when this happens, that this, when you see it, is a projection of the medulla. No different than a movie projector, making image. And that's because the seat of the human ego is here, in the medulla. Consciousness resides in the brainstem. This is one of the reasons they had a problem with this Terry Schweibel, or whatever her name is. Her consciousness, soul, was still in her brainstem. And yet, because her cerebral cortex had basically went made to liquid, there was no capacity to focus the soul through an ego. And this is why I had all this confusion. Is she alive? So, by the time you see third eye, which will be, the outer layer is yellow, which is the symbolic color of soul, and middle layer blue, it's the purest blue you can ever even imagine, symbolic color of God. And then finally you will see, all of us will see, it's independent of religion, a 5-pointed white star. And then you have all the fancy terminology. In Vedanta, this is called Amrita. In Christianity, it's called mystical marriage. In Taoism, it's called Tao. And Buddhism, suchness. That'd be literally the English translation, suchness. And by the time you see this, then your soul, by birthright, remembers how to merge with it. Pluto, merging. Soul, merging. And it merges with what? that which has created it in the first place. And that starts off as varying degrees of cosmic consciousness. It's not just one thing. Because when you first have these expanded states of consciousness, believe me, you still have a sense of duality. But in time, that sense of that sense of what duality stops, and it just goes from there. So, but let me say this too: that for those that are trying to live a spiritual life, even if you get to this place, you will not experience in a personalized sense, whatever the expectation may be, God. You're not going to go somewhere and find some form that you, oh, there's God. It just doesn't happen that way. And as far as you can get in human form, because there's a limit to the container. And I mean, to understand the limit of the container, I can ask you this question: who created God? From the point of view of the limit of our container, we can't know. But, and so as far as you can get really in your cosmic experiences, you can actually get to the place where you perceive what the Buddhist called the unmanifested manifested. And the perception of it is itself magnificent, of course. I mean, you're just in a state of wonder, you're in a state of ecstasy. Literally, natural ecstasy. And not these other things. And and so a good story that illustrates this is the story of Yogananda, because when he was a young man, roughly in his late teens, his guru was a man named Yukeshwar. And of course, Yogananda wanted to know God. And one day, Yukeshwar raps him on the forehead, and boom, he goes into cosmic consciousness, and all these spectacular things are occurring. And they are truly spectacular from the point of view of phenomena. And then suddenly he snaps back, as we all do, and he looked at Yukeshwar, and he goes, yes, but I want to know God. There you have it. So, any other questions? So it seems like we have come to a natural end time, not the end time of the rapture. And there couldn't be a more deeper delusion than this idea of the rapture. What a state of delusion this is. And it's classic Uranus and Pisces. What a delusion. But we've come to a natural end time, and I think what we've all discovered here is that despite what's going on our planet and all that, there are souls of like mind. There are souls still trying to do the right things. There's still souls that follow natural law. Natural law is a symbol where we can look at a hill. People coming up the hill, and the one above puts out arm below. There are still people doing this naturally. Don't give up the sheep. God bless you.